All right, so today we are going to talk about imperialism. Whoops, cancel that, hit the wrong button. Okay, a couple more people are joining in. Just give them 1 second here. Good morning, everybody. So what I'm going to cover first is a little section that is not on that note sheet. So in addition to your note sheet, we're going to add a few things. So you need some notebook paper. The topic that you're going to be adding is just basically imperialism. That's why I want you to title your note sheet, imperialism. It's my dog, sorry. And we're going to start with very briefly with Southeast Asia. And then we'll switch over because this is the order the book listed it, if that matters to you. But, well, I'm just rethinking that. Actually, I think I'm going to start with Africa first because that had some definitions there that would be helpful before we do this. So your book talks about Southeast Asia first, then goes to Africa, but we're going to do it out of order. I am going to do Africa first, but make sure you have that notebook paper so we can switch and over to that. But you'll see why I want to start with this in just a second. Okay, there we go. All right, so you should be, we're going to write down these definitions, and this will help us kind of understand all of the different countries that we go through when we talk about what imperialism is. You are welcome to abbreviate or summarize these definitions as long as you know what it means. Your notes are for you. But the big theme, imperialism for today, simply means that one country extends rule or authority of an empire over foreign countries. So the age of imperialism is sometimes called the age of empire building. It's when a stronger country has rule or authority over a weaker country. It could also mean that they're just acquiring colonies, or other countries are just dependent upon them. But for our purposes, we're talking about the age of empire building when stronger countries took over the rule of weaker countries. Those weaker countries are referred to as colonies. Think of the American colonies in early American history. They were ruled by Great Britain. So a colony is just a country or a territory controlled by a foreign power. Again, you don't have to write every word here. You write them how it makes sense to you. These are pretty detailed definitions. So imperialism is the verb of taking over. And what they're taking over is the colony. That is the weaker country or the territory. The protectorate is a country or territory that has its own government, but is under the control of an outside power. So a good example to give you a difference here is if you think of the American colonies, at that time, they were not a country. They were territories that were governed by England. But sometimes a country is a protectorate, like Bhutan in India. We'll talk about India today, was a protectorate of Great Britain. It was a country, had its own government, but it was still under the control of an outside country. So when countries embarked on this imperialistic ventures, they created what they referred to as spheres of influence. That simply means the areas that they have investment and trading privileges. So we're simply like, our influence is over this country. And I'll leave these here for a minute. And the last one is economic imperialism. And we're going to talk about this too today. So give you an example. An example of this would be what happened to Hawaii when it became part of the United States. It's an independent, less developed country that is controlled by business interests. So Dole pineapple that still exists today, that was a business power that controlled the whole island of Hawaii because of the economic ties. And they're the ones who force kind of the takeover. So I'm going to give you one more minute or two to write these definitions down. We go on line 10. Get my drink. Is everybody good, or do you need more time?
Miss Tanya, these definitions were on the notes.
Yes, that's what I said. I said I changed my mind. I am gonna go to the notes and then go back to paper because I thought you needed these definitions first. They make more sense. It's not the order your book went in though. All right, so let's talk about a couple more concepts, and these have a lot to do with why imperialism occurred and how people justified this taking over of other countries and exploiting their resources. So racism was actually a big factor. And basically what that meant was that there was a strong belief that there were races that were more superior than others. This definition here is too detailed, so you can fill in your blanks however you want to, but what I want you to understand is they felt that particularly Britain was really kind of guilty of this concept that they felt they were an inferior race. I mean, they felt like they were a superior race, and that the inferior races benefited from them coming in and changing their culture to be more like them. So they're literally developing systems based on this concept that they need to elevate those inferior races. But this is also after the Enlightenment period, when we talked about some of the changes or the detours away from religion. And social Darwinism was a very popular concept in politics during this age. And that simply meant that there was going to be a competition between social classes, and those who were biologically superior would always rise above. That's kind of what this definition here means. It's pretty detailed. So when these things occurred, when a country who felt like they were a superior race went in to take their natural resources from a country, they also were there to force assimilation. And that simply meant that when we come to your country, you have to adopt our culture. That's what assimilation is. So the conquering country brings their culture and they have to adopt it. And last, oh no, there's two more. Annexation just means that something is added. For example, we annexed Alaska to our country. We just added it. And then geopolitics is an interest in taking land for its location or resources. Alaska is another good example of that. Many people thought it was just a very bad purchase for the United States, and it turned out to be so rich in resources that it was a great bargain for our country. But that is geopolitics. We're taking it for its resources. Guam is another example that was taken as a territory because of its location during wartime, of being a halfway point to Asia. So that's what geopolitics is. So got your definitions here. And let's talk about this. What was the motivation for a country to go in and basically colonize or annex another territory and force those people to assimilate? Well, it falls back onto the racism definition, that there is a desire to spread their culture to an uncivilized world. So it is all what is in a belief system of who is the higher being in social Darwinism. And if you felt like you were more superior, you were justified in going in to try to elevate less civilized populations. But that really was kind of more of a justification than a motivation. The true motivation was the need for natural resources. And so as Great Britain really developed their textile industry in the industrialization age that we talked about, they needed more and more cotton. And India was a place that they could go in, and cotton grew very well there, so they could colonize it and get cotton for much cheaper. And as countries did this, their empires grew larger. So it set up a competition of who could build the largest empire. So sometimes there wasn't really a need to continue colonizing, except that you wanted to make sure there was a balance of power, that you were colonizing as many territories as your other country in Europe. So we've got culture, natural resources, and competition. So there was a time that there was a saying that there was a time that the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning they had colonized so much of the world. It was daytime somewhere in their empire at all times. So throughout its history, Britain has invaded all but 22 countries of the world. So a huge amount of empire building here. So much of history after this point was undoing this colonization and these countries learning to function independently again. But you see that is a huge empire. Here we go. That was my saying I just said. I don't have the notes in front of me anymore, so I could open them on my phone. I'm going to do that. I can get them open. That way I can make sure I'm not going too fast. I can see what you have to write. I'm almost there. It's a little bit slower on my phone. So there we go. I'll keep going while I, oh, here it goes. All right. Well, here's the thing. I got them open on my phone and I can't read them. I need glasses bad. Okay, we did that. We did that. Okay. So as this occurred on a massive scale, so you can see the number of countries here that in Africa. So we're going to focus on Africa first. The number of countries in Africa that were colonized, it was a massive scale. pretty much a very small fraction of the country was left untouched. Thank you. Sad that I can't read this. And why was that? What was this drive to go to Africa? Well, if you look at this map here, you can see that in Africa, well, first off, there was the concept that they were inferior races and that the races of the Western world were superior and had this moral duty to go over and elevate their culture to be more like the Western Europeans. But in addition to that, that was almost a justification for the process of being able to tap in to this variety of natural resources that could benefit their country without having to trade for it. So if you go in and you take over the country, you don't have to trade for these things. So if you look at particularly where we see the greener areas of all this agriculture, they're able to go in and get natural resources that grow very well on this continent, like coffee and cocoa or whatever you call that. But look down at the bottom of the key on the right. Look at all of these major resources here that can be used back in the countries that have colonized. And what is the climate like here? Well, the climate is actually a reason why certain areas of Africa came in and were conquered over other areas. So if you look at the top, the desert part is huge at the top. So sub-Saharan Africa, where it's more fertile and more natural resources are, there's going to be more competition. Whoops, can't touch the screen. So when they do come in, there is resistance. So what could make that resistance difficult? Why were they unable to keep this from happening? Well, first off, if you look at this map here and how colorful it is and how small the colors are in some areas, there's about 3,000 distinct ethnic groups in Africa, and they speak about 2,000 different languages. So what that does is it makes it very difficult for these countries to have a sense of unity to stand up and fight against their colonization. So in 1884, something was held called the Berlin Conference, Berlin in Germany. The goal is to establish an agreement, because if you look back, well, I'm not going to look back because I don't have time. I have too much to cover today. But if you look back in one of these regions, as industrialization, do you want me to go upstairs? Is occurring, and now they're developing some of these new natural resources that they did not do in the past. Well, one of those things was the use of rubber, because remember how we talked about transportation exploded and industrialization. So this becomes a need for new resources, and there is a territorial dispute in Congo, and so they meet together. So the Europeans who don't live in Africa meet in Berlin to decide how to divide Africa up among the European nations. It began over this dispute in the Congo. Germany has very little influence in Africa because it had only become a country about 12 to 13 years ago, when we talked about the unification of Germany, when Otto von Bismarck pulled that country together. But as a new country, he thought if he hosted this conference, it would really elevate his prestige. The sad thing about this meeting was there was no representation from the African countries themselves. So what are these reasons that they go in and settle? Why don't they just go in, take what they want and leave? Well, they end up settling. We've gone over this before. I'm going to quickly say it again. They felt like a natural selection. The more powerful humans, biologically superior, would rise to be the leaders. And they justified this by saying they had an evolutionary advantage. So if they had an evolutionary advantage that they were a more superior human, then they had the moral right to go in and be the ruler. It was sometimes referred to in history, and you'll see this often in history books, that one of their justifications was they referred to this as the white man's burden, meaning that it was actually they were being benevolent and helpful by going in and helping less advanced societies catch up with the rest of the world. So this is the colors. Oh, I can't touch my screen, but my thing's in the way. Of the people or the countries that went in and carved Africa up in this Berlin conference of who got to colonize where. So Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Belgium. So the Belgians were the ones who ended up going into the Congo area. King Leopold, I think we'll get to this, he was so cruel to these people that it was actually his cruelty and his influence that began to turn the tide where people begin to think this might not be ethical. Okay, so let's talk about South Africa for a minute, because that's a very different story from the rest of Africa. The Dutch people went into this area. You can go back down here. Look down at the very bottom there. They were farmers, or what was referred to in this area as husbandmen, and they began to settle in the Cape of Good Hope in 1652 with the Dutch East India Trading Company. So they were given the charge of operating the Cape of Good Hope and using it as a shipping location. So it was supposed to be basically a pit stop between the Atlantic trade networks and the Indian trade networks, places ships could stop and resupply. The climate there was very good for growing, and so the settlement actually grew. Got you here. The modern Afrikaners descended from this original group of people. So over time, so the Afrikaners are descendants of the Dutch people. The market becomes stagnated, or it slows down. It's not very profitable. The Dutch have many slaves from the indigenous populations, but they were the minorities in society. So what happens is they begin to move north and they begin to settle. They move away from this port and go north. So as a result, we talked about Napoleon and all the wars that he embarked on, but as a result, so the Dutch people move north and Britain comes in and takes over that area, and they actually begin to free some of the slaves. They were pushing other liberal ideas that were just new concepts in this area, so the Dutch weren't really happy about the changes. They don't like the new policies, and they move even further north to get away from British influence. So now we've got two European groups kind of having conflict in this area. So in 1852, jumping way ahead, Britain decides to grant independence to South Africa. So this is after the Dutch people have moved further north, but they introduced a system called apartheid. So what they're saying is, we're going to go ahead and let you be your own country, but this policy of apartheid, which is a systemic racist policy where everyone has to be separated according to whether you're white or black. That was the agreement for granting this country independence. So what happens is there's a war that develops over this. So we can't forget the Afrikaners are still there, the Dutch people. This is known as the Boer War, and it takes place after this apartheid is established in 1899 to about 1902. So the British have 500,000 troops in South Africa. The Dutch Boers have about 88,000. So the terrain is very difficult. The communications are very difficult. They don't have modern communications like we do, and they don't have modern transportation. Like the rest of the world is in the Industrial Revolution. This area of the world is very behind. So in this clash over what we're going to do with South Africa, the Boers basically just have to play defense, and they let the British attack. So this works out great for them because they've basically made their plan to be on the defense and not to waste any of their resources on being on the offense. So they did have the ability to defend their position. They had machine guns, they had rifles, and they had cannons. So this kind of gives us a preview of what's going to come in World War I, because all these clashes, the things we talked about on Friday, these are all things that are leading up to conflict all over the world that will eventually erupt into World War I. Britain eventually does win this war, and they get access to the largest gold mine in the world. There's also a large amount of diamond mines. All right, let's go to some other conflicts in Africa that were in your text. Let's skip this. All right, let's talk about the Zulu kingdom for further north up in Africa. So Shaka Zulu was a very skilled military warrior and leader, and in 1816, he created a really large state in Africa, the Zulu state. He was a very harsh dictator, ruled with an iron fist. Any opposition to him was sentenced to death. So he had a pretty organized military, which is something the West wasn't thinking they were going to encounter in Africa, because remember, they think everything that they have is superior, so they're not prepared to encounter anything that's organized. But he divides his military into 4 units, always uses the same plan in a battle, so it's rehearsed over and over again. I don't think that you have to write this. But yeah, you don't. It's all in your notes. Okay, so the first main force is the attack up front. He uses his second and third force to come around and encircle the opponent. And the fourth group was used as a backup just in case the enemy was able to break the lines. This was a 6-month war. It was called the Anglo-Zulu War. So think back early history, long time ago. Who were the Anglo-Saxons? Anglo-Saxons were the people that eventually became the English people. So this is the Anglo-Zulu War. It's British want to use the Zulu as labor for their diamond mines. That's what this war is fought over. We've just acquired this whole area of South Africa. Now we need some people to work for it, and we would like slaves. So the Zulu fight with shields that they've made out of oxhide, and they use long spears. The British fight with guns and cannons. So he is a very strong military leader who has a very organized way of fighting a battle. But because the Industrial Revolution has not expanded to this area, he loses because of less technologically advanced weapons. So again, we have more and more takeover of Africa here. Okay, let's talk about this guy. One of the things I'm really good at is mispronouncing words. So I don't really know. Menelik II was baptized. I don't know how to say it. Saul Mariam. So his father was supposed to become a king. His father dies in 1859. Menelik is taken prisoner. And while he's in custody as a prisoner, he ends up getting educated and marrying one of the emperor's daughters. I'm going to give you a second to write that. I'm trying to see how to pronounce that correctly. Okay. So what I want you to, I don't know how to, I think Menelik is about as close as I'm going to get. Well, we'll add this in just a second. All right, so he's taken, gets educated, marries an emperor's daughter. He escapes and changes his name. He claims he's actually a descendant from the line of Solomon. I'm going to tell you where he is in just a second. So what he does is he goes and claims this area called Shiwa, which is, and I need you to write this in your notes because I don't think it is in there. This is what is today Ethiopia. A lot of these details here you don't know. What you need to know down at the bottom is that he has the strongest army and claims the title of emperor. So he becomes emperor of this area that is today Ethiopia. It's not the entire region, but it's where Ethiopia is today. So Ethiopia is an area that's invaded in both world wars. So it's a important area when we talk about European colonization. There's a lot of competition for this region. He actually modernizes Ethiopia, and they get modern weapons, they get a railroad, and they get a telegraph system. So all of these reasons were the reasons that other areas in Africa were not able to compete with the invasions because they did not have these modernization. So he has the foresight to bring these things to his region. So who invades Ethiopia? Well, if you look at this map here, you can see from their border, they have 3 European countries sitting on their border, Britain in 3 locations, France and Italy. So there's a city in Ethiopia, Adwa, that is near the border where the Italians have a region. They invade in 1896, and there's the Battle of Adwa. Menelik wins this battle. So this is an unusual occurrence in the battles for Africa. So he leaks a fake telegram to the Italians because, see, he has that technology to make the Italians think that the Ethiopian force is very small. So what happens is these European countries develop a respect for Menelik's political reputation as a leader. So this is a very important point, and you're going to see this on a test. So you might want to put an asterisk by this. Is Menelik in Ethiopia? That is the African country that was able to fight off the invasion. So in his youth, Menelik owned slaves, but as an emperor, he abolishes slavery. He destroys mosques and replaces them with churches. But anybody who opposes him is maimed, including those who fought against him in the Battle of Adwa. So if anyone had any part of, or there was any word that they might be starting an uprising, what was traditional for him was to cut off their limbs or their arms or legs and cut off limbs to prevent future uprisings, or they would cut off right hands and left feet. Couldn't really do much. All right, so let's talk about Liberia. So many regions, and I have to go through this quickly because there's so much of the world to cover in imperialism. But in Liberia, so the root word of Liberia is the same root word for the word liberty, which is a synonym for the word freedom. So in the 1800s, as abolition movements spread, and abolitionists were people who fought to take down the institution of slavery. I just had a thought here. I think I forgot to record this class. Nope, I didn't. Sorry. I was just making sure I was recording. Okay. So when they freed slaves, there was this thought, now they don't have a place in our society. They no longer are slaves, but they're not educated and they don't have any way of assimilating into our society. So there was this idea that there was a need for a place to send them, but it needed to be a place that was free, hence Liberia. It was founded by free slaves from the United States, and they created a government and laws for all the settlers that would come there. They improved the economic conditions by trading in this country, and over time their borders grew to what it is today. So it was recognized by the United States in 1862, and the United States actually helped Liberia develop a constitution. It was based on the US Constitution, just an idea of how they can set up their country. Okay, why am I not moving? Here we go. All right, we're going to switch over to another one before I talk about the consequences, because we're going to talk about some other areas of the world. Okay, this is the one that your book began with, and it is the region of Southeast Asia. All right, so on notebook paper, imperialism in Southeast Asia. Okay, what started this? Well, the biggest motivation is the demand for Asian products. That's all you need to write. You just need to know that that is what started it. It drove Europeans to go and colonize Southeast Asia. I mean, there's some other motivations, just governments, political, that's a competition. The economic factor was the biggest. There was, again, the social Darwinism. This time there's also a lot more religious motivation of trying to come in and take over the religions of their cultures with missionaries, which actually caused several wars because of that. So this is the region of the world that we are referring to. So it's below China, above Australia, this region right here. So we've got pretty much the same countries again. Britain, France, the United States, Japan, the Dutch, the German, and the Portuguese. We don't have Belgium this time. This is much shorter here, so you won't have as much to go over. Some of the resources that they were looking for were cash crops. Also, they could get tin in this area, pineapples, and coffee, and tea. Oops, there we go. Go back here. All right, so talked about this benevolent philosophy of that you go in and it's the white man's burden to make a higher culture or bring a higher culture to the region and help them assimilate to it. When they came in, they would bring technology so that the areas would have transportation, communication. They would set up schools to educate the younger people how to read and write. And they would build hospitals and improve sanitation in the area. However, what they tried to do in that process of assimilation is they wanted to change religion to their religion, and they wanted to set up very distinct racial classes. And one of the biggest negative impacts is because they were there to get as many natural resources as possible. So they destroyed a lot of the land. They would clear the land to grow more sugarcane or grow more tea. So there was a lot of exploitation of the land itself. So the United States had their own era of imperialism, and they became a world power during this time. So there was a war at this time called the Spanish-American War between Spain and the US in 1898. It began because Spain had colonized Cuba, and the treatment of the Cuban people was so harsh that there was an outcry from the American people for humanitarianism in Cuba. And that's how it all began. There was a lot of dramatized journalism to spread the word among the American people of the need for them to come and intervene. So Cuba has decided to try to revolt against Spain and declare a revolution, and called upon the United States to come in and help them accomplish this goal. So they get involved in helping Cuba. So the United States wins after about 4 months of fighting. If you take US history, we'll go over this in detail. Not going to go over the war in detail today, just basically how this plays into the idea of the United States building their empire worldwide. So what were the results of the war? Well, Spain had many areas around the world that were colonies. Cuba does become independent, but in that process of winning the war from Spain, the US acquires Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippine Islands. Those 3 regions were all regions that were protectorates of Spain at this time. So I can't put that. So in addition to acquiring those 3 territories, also in 1898, they annexed Hawaii. That was one of our definitions at the top of the hour at the beginning of the class. That annexing means it simply adds it to their country. Alaska is not annexed. Alaska is actually purchased, then it's added to our country. So basically the justification for purchasing Alaska is to keep it from going to Russia. So let's talk about Hawaii for a minute, because we talked about the geopolitical imperialism. So Hawaii did not want to be part of the United States. They wanted to remain an independent nation. American plantation owners, this was the Dole Pineapple Corporation, decided that it would be in their best interest if they could overthrow Queen, I used to know, Liliuokalani, something like that. And they decided to band together to overthrow her. Now, they're not a country. They don't have their own military. This is a corporation. And they take over control of the Hawaiian government and use their influence, because they have a lot of economic influence, to get the United States to add Hawaii as a state. The Philippines, they have been ruled by Spain for quite some time. So once they get their freedom from Spain, the United States instantly comes over and acquires them when they win the Spanish-American War. But the Filipinos want independence from America just as much as they wanted independence from Spain. Instead, for a time, they become part of the United States, but they want something other than being a new colonial power. So we have a new war led by Emilio Aguinaldo. I don't know. I'm just going to go over this. Okay, so what the Philippines, war with America between 1899 to 1902. So America has expanded. We've got Alaska, we've got Hawaii, we've got Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. The Americans eventually win 1902. It doesn't change until we go to another lesson. Okay, I think I got one more region that your book went over. Go to the beginning of my PowerPoint here. Go to a map. All right, we're going to flip back to another region of the world. Why is it not working? There we go. All right. So let's talk about British imperialism in India. So I mentioned to you earlier about the need for cotton after industrialization in England. So the British East India Company won trading rights in the 1600s. But I'm going to skip all this because we're going to move ahead. Okay. So what was it like for India? So you can make on your paper now, because we don't have notes for this. Britain's control of India. Well, it was economic. India produced raw materials. India buys British goods. And they did not allow India to have competition with Britain. It was prohibited. So the economic control of India is one that is beneficial to Britain. Tea is a big cash crop for Britain. It becomes one of Britain's major exports around the world. So you see in the bottom left here where it says Lipton's Tea Garden. So a lot of the companies that you still see today developed from geopolitical imperialism in this day. We already talked about Dole pineapple. You can still go buy Dole fruit in cans in the grocery store, and you can most definitely still go buy Lipton tea. One of the biggest profit makers for Britain from India was opium. Opium is a drug that they make from the poppies that were grown in India, and it became a major source of income. They would grow this in India, make the opium, and it would go across the border where it was sold in China. So the British military kept a presence in India because this became so profitable for them. So it was like a drug cartel, basically, where they were trading opium or selling opium to the Chinese. And so because of this, in the long run, they became very active rulers and kept public order. They ended a lot of local wars, and they even began to train. If you look at the pictures here, these are Indian soldiers recruited to fight for the British Army around the turn of the century of 1900. So they made a lot of changes in India. They introduced a new education based on the English language. So that is a big change of the culture. They brought in their own set of laws that changed. I'm not going to go over the customs that it did, but there were cultural laws that existed in India that were replaced with British laws. They brought in Christianity. And so what this did was this made the Indian people feel like the British were trying to destroy their society and change their culture, eliminate Hinduism, and it started to develop a strain in the relationship. So Britain still felt the social Darwinism existed here. They're trying to take a less advanced society and make them more advanced, make them more like India. I'm sorry, make India more like Britain. So over time, they're training the armies. They're making a lot of money over this opium sell. But now what has happened is the Indian people have decided this isn't as beneficial to us as it is to the Britain people. So there is a rebellion that erupts. This is what I need you to write down because we've talked about this in Europe. Now we're going to talk about it here. In India, there is a rise in nationalism. And in 1857 is the Sepoy Rebellion. So the Sepoys were those Indian soldiers who fought in the British Army that we saw a picture of just a minute ago. So the Sepoys were Muslim, and in the Muslim culture, because remember, their culture is not acknowledged, but they still have their culture. They do not eat pork. The ones who are Hindus do not eat beef. So we've talked about nationalism before, that you are not acknowledging the ethnicities and the cultures of certain people groups, and those people groups bind together and rise up with a desire to defend the respect of their culture. So when they are in the English army, they have a new type of rifle. And to load that rifle, you have to bite off the end of an ammunition cartridge. Well, the British were greasing those cartridges with pork and beef fat. So this becomes very offensive to the culture of the Sepoys. So it has to do with the beef and pork fat on the ammunition cartridge. So there's a rebellion fought over this specific topic, and the British end the rule of the East India Company in 1858 as a result of this mutiny. So the East India Company who has been the controlling factor or the controlling entity in India, is now actually replaced by direct rule of the British government. When that occurs, so now we go from geopolitical to more of just that governmental political colony. They do remove some of those social regulations that caused all of the conflict with the Indian, but the distrust still continues. If you've ever seen the movie The Secret Garden, the beginning of the movie, I don't remember the character's name, but her and her family live in India. So during this time, it was very common for British families to move to India and make that their permanent home. And when they did that, they brought the European culture with them. And of course, there has to be more infrastructure built to accommodate the wealthy British people that do move to India. But with that, there is not equal treatment for the people who already live there, the indigenous people, the Indians. They're not treated equally. Basically, what they are doing is working for the English people who are moving in. It's very important for the British people who move there to have all the transportation and the communication. They design India's railroad system and bring the technologies of the Industrial Revolution to India. Okay, so what I want you to write, give you a Sepoy Rebellion ends British direct rule. Wealthy British families moved to India. Set up a class system, social class system, and they develop technologies in India. You don't have to know them all. However, if you think about that, we're sending wealthy people from the main country to this colony. They need banks, they need post office, they need communication, so telephone and telegraphs, and they need transportation. Okay, so well, I'm going to go back to my other one for this because I'm going to end with the one I started with. I'll just be a few more minutes. Okay, here we go. So even though this is back to the PowerPoint that was just on Africa, so at this time, not everybody was in favor of imperialism. There were a lot of people who felt it was unethical and immoral. Hence the number of political cartoons that were published at this time showing the detrimental effects of imperialism. So the picture on the left, the cartoon, is basically England grabbing up all these places in the world. England was probably the biggest grabber of land during the age of imperialism. The picture on the right is basically the carving up of China. I don't have time to go over China today, but I've already got 2 videos on China and Japan that I'm going to post, or I'll send out. I'll send it out in an email for you to watch. So what were some of the consequences of imperialism? Well, there was a lot of elimination of indigenous culture and this forcing of assimilation, which caused a lot of warfare and a lot of revolutions. And we'll talk about that when we talk about the Latin American revolutions. Which I think I had a PowerPoint for that. But I am out of time today, and I'm not done. Just give me a couple more minutes. If you need to go, that's fine, but I'm going to share one more thing about you. So what happens in these regions when they go in and they focus on the things that can just bring profit to the stronger country, the country that was colonizing? Well, they will focus on cash crops. When these countries win their independence, or when they try to go back into being a country without the stronger country in a leadership position, their farmlands have been converted to cash crop, and they don't have the farmland to grow the food for the indigenous people. So it produces famines. The result of this worldwide imperialism caused a worldwide sense of racism that has become a major issue from that point of history to today. Trying to replace cultures, trying to replace local goods. There were some positive effects. You cannot deny that these effects occurred not just in India, but in Africa and Southeast Asia. They were going in and building railroads, schools, telephones. So they were improving the technologies in the area. So those are your pros and cons in a nutshell. Okay, let me hit this. All right, so that is all I have time to go over today. We still need to cover Latin American colonization and then their fights to become independent countries. There is the modernization of China and Japan. You're going to have to watch some videos on. I already have those for you. You'll get them in an email. Also, class next week on Friday, that 10 days from now, that is when we will start World War I, which is a huge unit. So here's the thing though, I'm going to, because I'm going to be traveling that day, I'm actually going to have class in 1 week from today, but I will record that class. So if you aren't able to come next Tuesday, I will record the class and you can watch it online. Because technically the class is Friday. So all of the work will be due that Friday, which is the 18th, but we'll have an in-person class in 1 week from today. Okay, so you can watch the recording or you can attend class, and then you can do your work due on the 18th, and that'll be World War I. You do need to make sure you watch the videos that I send you, because all of these things we're talking about last week and today are how you will understand why World War I occurred. Okay, you good? Okay, I will
Thank
see
you.
you. You're
Thank
welcome. I'll
you.
see you next time.